Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at your seminar series. I am 5.5 months pregnant, so I sometimes can't. Not because I'm extraordinarily exhausted, but just because that's one of the effects of your body carrying an additional body inside of it. What I'm going to be talking about today is really a consideration of the sources of data that we use in transportation engineering and planning, with a particular eye to an ever important and increasingly even more important issue, which is equity, and how our data sources and the way that we collect our data influence our ability to make equitable transportation engineering and planning decisions, and how we can kind of think beyond our current paradigms in terms of the sources of data and implications for new solutions, or even utilizing our current solution in ways that are perhaps more equitable and achieve greater access to opportunities for all individuals in our communities. Now I just need to figure out how to advance my slides. So before I start, I really want to recognize the team that I work with, because I think it's really important to recognize that all of our work is done in the context of supportive, collaborative colleagues. So this project that I'm going to talk about today is really the result of ongoing work with a team of people. And we currently have a small amount of money from the National Institute for Transportation and Communities to do this specific project. So the project is interdisciplinary in nature and definitely a team effort. So I want to talk first about this idea of transportation equity, because it really undergirds my work, and talk about the historical context of it. So I'm sure we're all familiar with civil rights in the United States. In the seminal Civil Rights Act of 1964 included a section called Title VI, which basically said that all federal agencies providing services cannot discriminate based on race, gender, class, etc., and that there should be equal participation in the planning process around those programs that are designed to serve all individuals. So there was an initial, in the 1960s, recognition of equality and equal access to services that the federal government provides. Obviously, transportation is one of the probably most important services that the federal government provides, and something that probably every single person in the United States uses on a daily basis, practically. Many decades later, President Bill Clinton issued an executive order, which is sort of popularized this idea of environmental justice. So in the context, I think we think of environment, we think of greenery, we think of trees, etc. And it really stems from this idea that persons who are minority race, lower income, shouldn't be exposed to environmental hazards based on where they live or how they travel. In the context of transportation, this means that, according to the executive order of President Bill Clinton, that no services that the federal government provides can discriminate or disproportionately negatively impact underserved or certain populations. And the environmental justice concept really centered around key populations: individuals who are lower income, non-English speaking, minority race, ethnicity, and then persons with disabilities. In 2012, DOT and the Federal Highways Administration reaffirmed their commitment to environmental justice, saying that this was going to be a key component of their planning and engineering processes. However, we have continued to talk about transportation equity, right? I'm sure all of you have heard it. It's a common discussion topic at the Transportation Research Board. There's special issues of journals devoted to the topic. So why is it such an issue if it's been so long-standing in our federal policies around transportation? And I think one of the things that we need to look at is transportation equity versus equality. And there was an interesting paper that came out in 2017 that really tried to distinguish the idea of transportation equity versus equality. And I think a lot of our policies up until more recently have really really been more reflective of transportation equality than equity. So equity is this idea that these three key things must be in place for a transportation to be equitable and a transportation system to be equitable. Equal access to opportunities with an explicit recognition of underserved populations, which means that how you get to those destinations might not be a one-size-fits-all model, that based on different needs and different resources in your personal life, you may need different types of transportation and mobilities. And that's what's going to lead to increased access to opportunities. So the point is that transportation equity has sort of a driving goal. And so it's sort of thinking about it from a design perspective, that if we have equal access to opportunities, that is sort of predicated on an equitable transportation system. And so then thinking to yourself, well, to what extent does my transportation system truly provide equal access to opportunities? And it does that by recognizing this multimodality and differential type of transportation system, that there's not just one or two options available that we should all be able to fit ourselves into. Increasingly, in addition to this idea of transportation equity and the conversation around it, there has been a renewed and increasingly urgent commitment to transportation equity through this executive order that was issued in January of 2021, so this year, by President Biden. And it's issued sort of in conjunction with the infrastructure bill that I'm sure we've all been following, right? The largest infrastructure bill since the New Deal of the 1930s. He issued an executive order. This is what it's called. This is a hyperlink. So if you have access to the PowerPoint or the PDF after the presentation, you can go and read it. Advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. What does this specifically mean? Well, 40% of infrastructure funding has to be devoted to underserved communities in recognition of the chronic and historic underinvestment in those communities. So that means when we look at transportation planning, 40% of those monies are going to have to go into underserved communities, right? So it really reaffirms and puts financial backing behind our commitment to transportation equity and planning. So all of you who are involved in future careers in transportation engineering really need to be aware of the importance of this, because your designs, your plans are going to have to come at least through some paradigm, through a transportation equity paradigm. But there's also this issue that sometimes comes up with equity and which is sustainability. So the sustainability, I just have called it here the sustainability transportation equity conundrum. And it's really predicated on the land use of the United States. Our space is our biggest, it's like our Achilles heel. It's a privilege for us in the United States that we have so much space and manifest destiny, but it is also one of our greatest weaknesses, particularly around transportation and land use, right? Because we can build and build and build and build, spread and spread and spread. But that means that really mobility in the United States in so many places, and this is not true everywhere, but it is the predominant privilege of mobility is personal vehicleship, right? You have to have a car to get around. And of course you can get around many ways, but to get around efficiently in a time-effective manner, to get places quickly, to access all those opportunities equally and quick, you really need a car. Persons without a personal vehicle, often individuals who are lower income or disproportionately Black or Indigenous persons of color, often disproportionately rely on fixed route transit, public bus systems, etc. Those don't provide equal access to opportunities, particularly in low density land use environments such as Knoxville, right? But do we really want everyone to have their own car? Because we can give everyone their own car and then maybe we'd see greater transportation equity. But what is that? What are the implications for the environment? We want people who have cars to have fewer cars and to have more green cars, right? We don't necessarily want to increase cars on the road. In fact, we know from transportation planning, right, that if you add an additional lane to a freeway, you don't reduce congestion, you just increase the number of cars that can travel on that freeway, right? So how do we achieve transportation equity but still think around the box of personal vehicles, which seem to be so dominant in our planning systems in the States. And we know that engineers are always trying to think around cars and trying to think of different ways. But if you look at our transportation planning design, it still is predicated on a personal car for mobility. And if not a car, then a bus. So I think that one of the ways that we can start to get at this is through different data sources and more interesting data. We need what we call latent demand data. So that's data around where would people go if they had greater mobility. And we need that sort of data from more diverse pools of people so that we can create better prediction models, we can do better scenario planning, et cetera. What if all individuals had equitable access to transportation? When would they go? How often? How frequently would they travel? Where would they go? What modes would they use, right? So we really don't have good answers to those types of questions because we really don't have good data about how people travel outside of a couple of primary forms of transportation. And if we had these types of data in more plentiful and diverse sources, we could answer some pretty interesting questions, like who takes more trips, people who own cars versus those who don't. The assumption is that persons who own cars are going to take more trips, right? So that goes back to that sustainability thing. If you give someone a car who doesn't have a car, then you're putting one more car on the road and one more trip on the road and one more opportunity for pollution, right? Does car ownership, auto ownership affect where we go and the distance of those trips? I would bet that it does, right? If you have a car, you can travel further. We know that cars facilitate suburban lifestyle, right? Because you no longer have to live proximally to your job. You can live way, way out west. If lack of auto ownership suppresses trips, what kinds of trips does it suppress? Does it suppress what we would call sort of privileged or unnecessary trips? Does it suppress essential trips like health trips? This would be really important in the context of a global pandemic such as COVID, right? Who gets to go and get their vaccine? What are the implications for auto ownership and increasing auto ownership or suppressed travel on the environment? Is actually having fewer people without having a certain group of people in the States without cars actually beneficial for our environment, or actually helping to at least in some way reduce the amount of pollution? Well, we don't know, but we also know that it's not from a human perspective. You can't suppress person's travel. So we need to think about, we need to have more data so that we can start to answer these questions and then think around what are the answers and what are the solutions. So I guess one of the questions is, well, where do we get most of our national planning data? It comes from the National Household Travel Survey. So most municipalities have local sources of data and other sources of data, but the main source of data that we rely on for infrastructure planning at DOT is the National Household Travel Survey. So I put this picture up here. I don't know if you have any history buffs out there who are familiar with the Dewey versus Truman election outcome. I don't know if any of you have heard of Dewey, but you probably haven't because he was never elected president. This was the 1948 presidential election. Harry Truman, who did become president, was a Democrat running against Thomas Dewey, who was a Republican. Early polls predicted that Dewey would win, and that so much so that the Chicago Daily Tribune even printed a front page headline that Dewey defeats Truman. That's how sure they were by the polls, the political scientists, that Dewey was going to win. Well, Truman won. He won 50%, or what was it? He won, what was it? 50% of the popular vote. So what exactly happened there? Well, when they looked back at the polls to see how they had collected those data, they found that pollsters had used this new form of sampling called quota sampling, where they stratified the population based on race and ethnicity, and that's how they sampled persons, but they forgot to stratify on income. So what happened was by failing to stratify on income, they oversampled for individuals who were higher income, who were also more likely to vote Republican. So the data that came back were biased towards Republican voters, more Republican voters in the sample, more persons reporting to vote Republican. So Dewey comes out on top in the polls, but in the actual popular vote, Truman comes out. I think there's possibly some lessons that we could all learn. This is sort of a common story that you present in research methodology classes around sampling bias because it's so common. Human fallacy and how and who we go to ask for information. And to some extent, I think it might be present in the National Household Travel Survey as well. If you look at the 2017, which was the most recent survey done, if you look at the sampling strategy, recruitment was done via mail, and then completion of the actual survey was done via online. They did do some things to adjust for validity and reliability issues in the online survey, recognizing that people would be self-administering it. But if you think about it, first of all, someone has to have a permanent address. Someone has to check their mail and read it. They have to be literate in English. They have to have broadband if they're going to fill out that survey online. They have to have the time. So it's possible, if you look at where our sources of data are coming from, that we're presenting to our federal government some slightly skewed information about transportation planning, right? So we should be thinking about, well, if these are the people who are providing us information about how they travel, it's likely that those persons are going to be more likely to own cars. They're going to be more likely to have mobility. They're going to be a slightly higher income. They're going to be more likely to be white. They're going to be more likely to be potentially living in higher income neighborhoods, right? Places with more infrastructure in place, because they have to have mail systems. They have to be able to read what comes to them. They have to be able to have broadband, etc. So one of the things that has been increasingly used is travel to measure and collect more diverse sources of travel behavior are travel diaries in the form of apps. So the team that I'm working on did a scoping review just to look into the published scholarly literature around travel behavior data collection apps to see what's actually being tested and validated in the academic literature. So it's possible there are more apps than this that are in what we would call the gray literature, or just apps that haven't been reported on in academic settings. But what we know of in terms of apps that have been actually tested and studied in a rigorous empirical manner, we found a total of 18 apps. But if you look across those apps, you sort of see some disparities in where and how those apps are being used. So 14 of them were being used for personal transportation. 6 were also being used for engagement with public transit. If you look at the populations, only one, which is actually the one that my team was working on, focuses specifically on environmental justice populations. And then the types of data that are collected, very common transportation mode and transportation plans. Interestingly, not all of them collected transportation barriers. And only about half collected data on trip destination. Very few collected anything around social components. So connecting the travel behaviors and mobility to some of the larger, broader experiences of life. So really bringing into a more public health component, looking at social component. There are very few who looked at that. And then only one, which was the app that I'll talk about in a minute, looked at what we call latent travel demand, or wished for travel demand, travel that you would take if you had the mobility to do it, or trips that you planned that you were not able to take because of lack of mobility. So what I'm going to present now on for a couple of slides is this app that my group came up with to kind of think about how can we collect latent travel demand, and specifically from underserved populations. So what we're developing is an app that has software compatibility across mobile and and tablet technologies, currently working on Android, downloadable, and involves both quantitative and qualitative data collection. So we're trying to capture not only people's sort of number of trips and distance traveled, but the quality of those trips and their impact on their lives. Capturing those transportation behaviors specifically for underserved populations. So really thinking broadly about where you might go across a diversity of populations, the specific needs that you might have within the context of transportation, mobility for single parents, for persons with disabilities who are trying to get around in a motorized wheelchair, etc. Latinx population, so thinking about issues of documentation, thinking about issues of language. Also bringing into this actually with the Latinx population, we've been introducing ideas because our sample currently is in Arizona, thinking about climate and how that impacts travel and mobility, particularly for underserved populations who may be standing outside on a bus stop, for instance. And then this component of what we're calling latent trips, which is uncompleted or wished for, but not taken trips. Exploring the importance of a trip that you miss in terms of its impact on your health, your psychological well-being, your social engagement, your employment or education, exploring mood changes, and then this, again, the social dynamics of travel. So this is just a quick chart that shows sort of where we see most travel diaries collecting data and what's missing. And again, it's this unserved or failed trip. So most travel data that's collected is collected on the actual data that's collected. So if data are not collected, if a trip is not taken, then no data are collected. And that's a problem, right? Because how do we know if someone wanted to take a trip, but they didn't get to take that trip? What would have been the implications? And where would they have gone? And how would they have gone there? And so this unserved or failed trips is a big gap in our data, our transportation planning. And also we have this component, which I'll talk about briefly, which we just think is interesting, which is this idea of travel history and contextualizing people's mobility and their human experience and human history. And this is just kind of a quick slideshow of the flow by which we're testing the app. So we started with preliminary focus groups with engineers, planners, and social service experts here and in 2 other sites. In Arlington, Texas, which if you're familiar with North Central Texas, it's one of the largest metroplexes in the United States. But unlike a lot of the other metroplexes that we think of on more coastal sides, it has no geographic boundaries, so it's extraordinarily spread out. And then also Arizona, so we also looked at borderland communities and issues of weather and documentation and immigration status. We then did preliminary focus groups with end users about the use of the app and questions that they might want to see and understandability and feasibility, et cetera. We refined the app using computer science engineers. Then we've been currently recruiting partners to actually recruiting participants from community partners to pilot test the app. We're having persons use the app for 14 days and they'll be receiving incentives throughout the use of the app. And then we're going to be using graduate research assistants in a way we call travel buddies, and I'll talk about those in a moment. And then finally, there'll be an exit interview for the participants. So here's just the basic components of the app, which I'll talk about and show in a screenshots in a few minutes. You have a trip planner, a trip review, challenge logger, the travel buddy, which is where we introduce the qualitative component and the engagement with the experience of using the app and thinking about your mobility, and then travel history. So the following slides, this is just a couple of screenshots of the app itself. And when you log on, this is what you would see is all these options. So you can kind of click on which thing that you want to use. And this middle panel shows the trip plan. So you would start by selecting your date and then where you want to go. And so it was things like this that went into a lot into the development of the app around environmental justice populations, was really trying to think across the diversity of places that you might go, and thinking as much as possible from a very diverse and intentionally equity-minded perspective about things like destinations. And then that third panel is logging information about how important that trip is going to be for you, and then how you're going to get there. So it's not just how you're going to get there and where you're going to go, but the importance of that trip and what it's doing for you in terms of your life. And then we also have, at the end of the day, they're asked to do a trip review. So we asked them things like how much did completing this trip improve your mood? How important was it to you? Did you have any problems, and what were those problems? And then questions like, what was the source of transportation that you actually used, so we can compare how they planned to get somewhere and how they actually got there. Because we often find with individuals who don't have their own cars, and who are relying on a lot of different sources, like relying on either friends or family or paratransit, that they sometimes have a plan for how they're going to get from A to B, and that plan changes. And so we want to see how their plans shift between the actual plan and the implementation, if they went with someone, if they had some help them get around, et cetera. And then in the event that they document that they missed the trip, they weren't able to take it, we have questions about the implications of missing the trip. And then also, this is just this panel here on the right-hand side. It's just more about the trip review. To what extent did you complete all the trips that you planned for the day? So we really want to know people's success in their trip planning. So it's not just so much where did you go today and how far did you go, but what were you intending to do and what did you actually do? Because we've heard anecdotally in our qualitative research that this is an issue. The persons plan for these days and need to get places, and then they can't get there because of transportation obstacles. And so what we want to do is capture quantitatively some of the discrepancies between trip planning and trip implementation.
Quick question, as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking of some of our travel diary work that we ask the question, if this mode wasn't available, what would you have done? And one of the options always there is no trip at all. So you're capturing the kind of the inverse of what you're describing. Is this new mode of transportation has enabled the completion of a late trip. Have you seen any other studies that have asked the question that way and tried to kind of triangulate?
No, but that's a really good
completed latent trips versus if you follow what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that I think that's really interesting, but we haven't. That would be interesting to add to this one. I haven't seen any studies though that have triangulated it.
Okay.
So we also have a challenge logger, which is a feature they can select on the home screen. And so that allows them to take pictures that they would upload here or record audio. And that's basically as they're going around throughout the day. And I'll show you an example of this in a few slides. And they encounter an obstacle. For instance, the example I'll show you is someone in a wheelchair and the sidewalk breaks down and just becomes rubble. How and what do you do? So they can document infrastructure challenges to their own mobility. The panel on the far left side is the travel buddy. Because the participants that we're working with are particularly may have potentially lower literacy, less time available during their day, potentially have less digital literacy. We're really working to engage them in the trip planning process. And so the project pairs participants up with what we call travel buddies. And they check in on them across the course of the 14 days through this text messaging feature that's embedded in the app and has like a little ringtone and all this stuff. We've also put into the travel buddy a set of questions around what, this idea of social exclusion. This is a really basic poverty framework that's used in the UK and in Europe a bit more widely than it is here in the States, but it's linked in the UK very closely to transportation and mobility. And the idea is that when you're very low income and you lack your own car, you're often excluded from many aspects of society, not just employment and education, but opportunities to vote and to be part of the political process, et cetera. So we've embedded into the travel buddy a set of questions that the GRAs use across the 14 days. They ask all of these questions to the participants, the same set of questions, and get them to speak to some of the ways by which they may be experiencing social exclusion through transportation disadvantage. So questions like, how do you get around to get essential services like food or meet doctor's appointments? And if you don't, what does it feel like? And so it's not just in the trip review, quantifying if I missed a trip, this is how I felt not very good, but also qualitatively and globally across your life experience. You know, what do you think about how your transportation has been impacting your ability to get around, to be part of your community? And we also just found anecdotally that the travel buddy became this really high engagement component of the study where the persons using the app really connected with the travel buddy and wanted to tell them all sorts of things about their mobility. They love talking about their transportation. I think most of us all of you who are in transportation research find that you love transportation, but you'd be surprised how integral it is to the life experience of almost every person. It's like this ingrained thing, and when you start getting people to talk about it, they just have tons to say. And then the other thing we ask our participants to do is on their own time across the course of the 2 weeks is to fill out this set of questions, and they don't have to fill out every one, but kind of things that strike them, their travel story. So really also to kind of get them engaged in the experience of transportation and mobility is thinking about growing up, childhood road trips, their first car, their favorite car their parents had, how many cars they had, what was their first car. I remember my first car. Do you all? Do you remember who taught you how to drive? Things like that. Getting your driver's license is a rite of passage in the United States, right? Driving cessation, which we think is really important too, in looking at mobility. So when you started to drive and when you stopped driving, we've added components around biking and safety to reflect sort of feminist geography ideas of how women might feel less safe in their mobility and how that's going to influence their mobility. So this allows us to capture sort of a panoply of issues that contextualize people's trip and travel behaviors. Oh, not best test, I'm sorry, that should say beta test. So we did a beta test, which seems like forever ago, in Tarrant County, Texas, which is part of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And we partnered with Meals on Wheels, which provides meals to persons with disabilities who are homebound, basically. It's disproportionately older adults, but there's also persons who are not necessarily 65 and above, but who are disabled, homebound, and don't have any way to prepare their own meals. We had 10 adults, 70% were female, 50% were African American. And we asked them to log their trips. So just a couple of quick results. More than half of those trips were planned and rated as very important. Trip destinations, not surprisingly, but first and foremost was to the grocery store. So this is actually relationship to food and transportation. I think is perhaps an under-recognized and really important issue for particularly for persons who have restricted mobility. But getting out and getting to the store for food was the #1 priority for them in terms of they had to prioritize their mobility and where they were going. Medical appointments, social visits, in the bank. They were unable to complete nearly half of the trips that they planned, and half of the trips to the grocery store were unplanned, which also talks kind of about how we eat, and how if you think about it, if you had to meal plan and you only had one opportunity to go to the grocery store and you had to make sure you got everything you wanted in that 1 week, it's that might take a great deal of planning on your part. The challenge logger example, so here's what I was talking about earlier. So this person took a picture of the street, and so this is just really interesting kind of on the ground infrastructure of impediments to people's mobility, particularly when you don't have your own car. So in this case, the participant had a motorized wheelchair, so he had to travel on this very large arterial road for a period of time because they were constructing a sidewalk and didn't have a walk around safe space set up. And I think we all know this happens more often than not, right? The construction crews just kind of put up some orange cones and just say, sorry, you can't walk here. And then in Travel Buddy example, we had asked someone, how does transportation access affect your overall quality of life? And this person said, well, I rely on bus, MITS, which is, I think that's a public transit service in Tarrant County. Another transportation for grocery, personal care outings, visiting friends, and just seeing the city of Fort Worth. If my mode of transportation is not available, then it would be hard for me to accomplish the aforementioned reasons that I use the local transportation. I can find a bus route to go to certain places. The drop-off location is quite a distance from where the bus stop is, like today. Being that my regular driver was not available, and this person used paratransit, I would have had to take the bus. The bus stop for my doctor was 15 minutes away from his office. That would require me to drive my power chair, so his, I think this is a woman, her wheelchair, 15 minutes both ways. This would have been an inconvenience for me, so therefore I had to cancel the doctor's appointment. I hope this thing explains how you how things run when you're disabled and need transportation. So this is a good example of what we would call a missed trip or latent travel. So because the bus driver for the paratransit wasn't available, she just canceled her trip. And then just some examples of travel story. I stopped driving about 7 years ago when I was diagnosed with degenerative bone disease. Happened about 15 years ago. I didn't have a car but my driver's license, and I could no longer afford to maintain a car. I would still be driving if I had a car. So thinking about all the reasons why people might stop driving helps us to kind of start to capture some of the diversity of their experiences. But returning and thinking now about ways that we could collect data in a little bit more diverse manner and capture broader issues around mobility, thinking back to our issues of data and sustainability. So I just really like this image because I think that in the States, so often we have this idea that it's either public transit or it's a car, right? So is this really what we mean when we say equity? And does this really promote equity? And does it really promote sustainability? I think the answer we know is no. So we need to be thinking more along the lines of this idea of smart, connected, equitable, and sustainable transportation. And the more diverse our data sources in terms of the persons whom we're collecting data from and the different types of questions that we're asking of those individuals, the more we can create smarter, better connected, more equitable, and more sustainable transportation systems. And why? Because we're going to have better models. You're going to have better prediction. You're going to have better scenario planning. We can start to answer questions like feasibility, adoption, likelihood of adoption, barriers to adoption, where people would go, what would be the threshold for getting someone to switch from one type of transportation mode to another type. And then thinking about all these different, we have all these different ideas that are floating around in the transportation world about emerging and new current transportation systems. But we really don't have widespread transfer of these new ideas to underserved communities. In fact, we just did a set of focus groups and someone complained, they said, well, you know, all these new transportation technologies, they go, and you know who are the first adopters? People who have cars. So the people who actually don't have the mobility issues are the ones who are the first to adopt all these alternative mobility options. I mean, one of the great examples I think of is this micro-mobility movement, the scooters. Who's using the scooters in Knoxville? Well, it's predominantly people that have a credit card, who are younger, who are more mobile, right? It's not the single mom living over, you know, in the public housing development over on Central, right? So how do we take these and move them and spread the resources and make it so that we are achieving this equity? Thinking about things like car shares co-located with affordable housing communities. We could do that, but we just need to bring the car shares there, and we need to think about adoption issues and feasibility issues. Cashless payment systems. So we have all these new mobilities that require you to have a credit card. Well, many persons who are underserved are also unbanked, right? They don't have a credit card, so there's no way for them to pay for that. So a lot of the social service agencies and communities have been trying to get around that by giving people vouchers, but we can make that a broader system and an automatic system, right? Obviously, electric powered public transit seems like an obvious one, but it's still not entirely there, which, you know, it should be 100% of our buses, right, should be electric vehicles. And we should have EV charging stations more plentifully distributed across communities, not just where we have Teslas, right? Pooled ride shares. So a lot of communities in Knoxville have actually, I don't know if they've done this yet, but they've been asked by what's called there's a interfaith organization that's a community organizing organization here in Knoxville called Justice Knox, and they focused on transportation as their campaign issue last year. And they had an assembly in Knoxville in May where they invited the city mayor and a variety of other officials in elected positions to this assembly. It was open to the public, and they publicly asked the city to sign a commitment to identify a pooled ride share and bring it to the city as an alternative mobility option. I think the city signed it, but I don't know if they've actually signed a contract. But a good example of that would be Via. So it basically, it's kind of like a hybrid between a bus and a ride share. So you can call this ride share. It's supposed to be on demand, door to door, but you share the ride with other persons who have also called the car in that same general area. It works really well in places like New York City or places where you have high population density. It would work super well in a place like the college campus or also downtown, or in areas such as in North Knoxville. Potentially it could be used more in East Knoxville. Something else that has come up is we tend to put a lot of expectation on users for navigating their environments and using the new technology. So you have to have a phone, you have to be able to call the Uber ride, you have to know where to stand to wait for the ride, etc. Right? You have to be able to read the maps, you have to be able to see where all the transportation services are. But why not make public transit operators carry some of that burden, or even give them some of the power, give them more data so that they can be a little bit more on demand and a little bit less fixed route. One of the issues with fixed route is that it really is a not super efficient way. It's great for the environment and it's great for the public transit, but it's not so great for the riders. Fixed route usually means that you wait a really long time for your ride. And then once you're on the bus, you have to wait a really long time to get to your destination. So, and if you look at these buses, there's like nobody on them, right? There's like 4 people, but they have a route they have to travel. And sometimes they'll sit at a bus stop if they're early because they have to stay on track. So you're like, what the heck? Like, why are we still sitting here? I have to be somewhere in 5 minutes and we could just go. So if you gave public transit operators more data and more real-time data, that they could be perhaps moving and a little bit more mobile in their public transit. And sort of centering all of this is this idea of new mobilities, right? This idea that mobility isn't just transportation. It's where you live, it's land use, it's thinking about economic levels, it's thinking about physical abilities and mental ability, right? But situating mobility within this broader context of not just transportation, but our engagement with our communities, our life satisfaction, our health. We've seen, public health has been such an issue over the course of the last 22 months. And so much of the conversation has been around how are people getting access to COVID tests, COVID vaccines, et cetera. Well, so much of that involves your transportation, right? The thinking about transportation in that model, that broader new mobilities, helps us to bring into these ideas of equity and sustainability. So with that,
Courtney, I had one quick question.
Yeah.
The connectivity, do you mean like social connectivity or what kind of?
Oh, no, that's a good question.
Connected?
Well, I think an equitable system is going to bring social connectivity to persons. But when I say smart and connected system, transportation systems, I mean we need to be using our data more effectively, right? We need, this idea of data for public transit operators. So they have a computer screen, they know how many people are waiting at that bus stop. Can they just skip that bus stop? Could people like order the bus? Subsidized cash payment systems, pooled ride shares, that's all based on people having access to information about where the ride's going to be and when it's going to be and how many people are in that area. So where would be the best place to request people to wait for that ride share, right? We have so much information and data, but we're just not really bringing it into, we're not connecting it we're trying to, but we're not connecting it nearly as well as we could be. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is when buses, there's usually a bus stop at every affordable housing unit in Knoxville. So Knoxville, the city of Knoxville, has what's called the Knoxville Corporation for Development, and the Knoxville Community Development Corporation, which operates affordable housing units across the Knox County region, right? And there's usually a bus stop at all of those affordable housing sites. But could you use like the buses that are coming there and create some sort of data dump system where you could find out, well, how many people need rides today and what time do they need them and where do they need to go, and create more like informed on-demand information for the transit operators so that they could serve the housing units more effectively through public transit. Because right now the fixed route just says every day the bus is going to go here, 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 and here, and it's going to be at each of these stops at these times. regardless of how many riders or when they get there, right? So knowing that we have all these different ways of collecting data and thinking about where people are moving, we should be using those data more effectively. But it also depends on having more diverse person feeding data into our information systems. So that is it for me. And then also there's just some references on the last page if you're interested.
How much? So, of course, ask any questions at this point.
What was your website again? It was like
Oh,
transferequity.utt.
yes. So we built this website to just kind of highlight the project. And also it has some interesting, we've just been collecting information about COVID and transportation and some of the CDC and the DOT and Federal Highway Administration statements about COVID. We also have sort of that historical that set of federal policies. Sorry.
With COVID, there seems to have been, I was thinking about this randomly this morning, but you know, all of the guidance, everything, if you want a COVID test, show up, do not get out of your car. If you don't have a car, you're not going to go by transit to go get a COVID test. You might think about an Uber, but how do people without cars get a COVID test? And if they have COVID, how do they get to the doctor? Do they ambulance? Do they?
See, why we should know this by now.
I don't
we
know.
haven't. We have.
Yeah.
So I know KCDC did do vaccine clinics on site. So they tried to at least bring the vaccine, and they might be doing testing on site. I don't know. So what they have been trying to do is co-locate testing and vaccine distribution at some of the sites where they know persons might have less mobility. But that again, it's like this fixed thing where if you just happen to be available at that time to get it or to get tested, and maybe 3 weeks later after the testing is there, now then you need it. I don't know. It seems like we should be tracking that. I don't know of anyone.
Anytime something says don't come by car and don't leave your car to get whatever, to get a drive-through hamburger at McDonald's. You know, I think about these kind of structural issues about if you don't have a car. You know?
Well, and this is how embedded transportation system is in our society. That it's so inextricably linked to our public health, which means public means everyone's health. But we even have our transportation systems predicated even in the connection with public health to a personal car. And it's so essential to your mobility and to everyone's health at some level if it's now affecting people's ability to get COVID tests and get vaccines. The only thing I know is that they have been trying to co-locate some of the vaccine clinics and distributions at places where people might have limited mobility. But that also means that you're living in some sort of facility. Like if you're just living by yourself and aging in place, or you're a single mom and you're living in your car and you're not going to show up for a COVID test if you're living in your car and trying to stay under the radar. I know in Knoxville, one interesting thing is the homeless population. They really haven't seen an outbreak in that population. Which we think actually has something to do with how socially marginalized persons who are homeless are in our society, because we haven't really seen any like mass outbreaks in that group, which they did initially expect to happen. But
So how many of people in the population don't have a car? Do we, I mean, from NHTS, we can find out, but, and we do, I mean, people look at driver, carless and how what their mobility levels are, especially in environmental justice, as you were saying, but do we have a sense of what it might be in Knoxville as to,
I don't know the data.
5% of the population or 10 or?
I don't know. I don't know if we even collect that sort of, I mean, we might collect it in data. We'd have to talk to, the transportation planning. Somebody over there they would know if they have those data. But the problem with those data is that those are very biased samples,
Right.
because the very fact that you don't have a car means you're more likely to not be easy to get to, right? Like you're living under a bridge, or you're couch surfing, so you don't even have a physical address. So, or you share one car with like 10 people or something like that, or you don't speak English and you're undocumented. So there's a variety of factors that co-occur with lack of car ownership. They're going to make you more likely to not respond to that question or not even be asked.
So what's the big solution then, to our laws in our National Household Travel Survey, would you say? I mean, this is an example, but it's kind of small scale. Is this meant to validate the level or estimate maybe the level of error in our National Household Travel Survey? So you say, well, we did this and we found that the National Household Travel Survey is missing 3% of people that account for something, whatever. I don't know.
I mean,
What's
it's
the solution? Yes.
possible that you could use it for validation, or you could also, I mean, a variety of local municipalities are trying to collect some of these data. So you could kind of use some sort of meta-analysis to look across samples and look across results, and then use that to validate or identify gaps in the National Household Travel Survey. Another option is to use this to show that maybe we need to be doing oversampling in specific communities. So the system that they have is this really just kind of stratified system, but they need to probably be doing oversampling in areas where we would expect people to be carless. So why not go to public housing sites, right? And intentionally sample there, or oversample in zip codes that are majority minority race ethnicity, or so many, such and such below the federal poverty threshold and things like that, right? So I think there's those are two approaches I could see. But it's interesting that they're not even trying to stratify at all or oversample for groups that we know would be high risk for not having their own car. And obviously, if you go by mail and then you go by online, those just two really obvious methodological errors in a way. It gives you a good snapshot of the persons who have cars and where they go. That's what it gives you. It reinforces our sense that a car is necessary in the States, because we're oversampling essentially for persons who have cars, and they're going to tell us how often they drive and where they go and yada yada. And that just reinforces the idea that, oh, people are taking more trips, they're taking longer trips, we need additional freeways and more highways and more lanes and more toll roads. It is to our detriment to collect the data in a way that just reinforces our current transportation plan. And it makes it more difficult to move these, new technologies into standard practice. I can't get back to it, but I mean, some of these things these are not new ideas, they really aren't. So why are they still kind of like emerging? And why haven't they been used?
So where do you see the highest impact? I mean, if we were to prioritize these ideas, where?
Well, they're different. I mean, this is a sustainability impact. This pooled rideshare has been very effective in high population density communities. It potentially could be looking at where you placed it strategically in Knoxville. So you really want to look at population density. You could get some. Something out of that. And the problem with Knoxville is it's so suburban and the land use. I mean, if you look at like West Knoxville, it's really hard to walk around in West Knoxville. So pooled rideshare requires you to go across it. It's not as door to door as Uber or Lyft. So it might tell me that I need to go across the street and wait on that street corner over there. Well, like in Cedar Bluff, geez, I'm gonna kill myself if I do that, right? I think this could be really great because you could get people, you could have shared resources. So you could give people the on-demand door-to-door flexibility and mobility that they want, but you wouldn't have to have everyone with their own car, especially because everyone's not driving all the time, right? So co-located affordable house, car shares with affordable housing. We really don't see like Zipcar in Knoxville at all, right? Well, why not? This would be a perfect place to have it, right? Because you have a parking lot, you have cement, you can put the cars there, and people can share the cars. So that's one area where I think we could make a big impact. I think again, pooled rideshare, if you demographically and placed it in the right place, could. Data for public transit, I think this has been under tested, but the basic idea to me seems like really powerful to give the transit operators, the bus drivers, more information so they can be a little more on demand and a little less fixed route. And this obviously, you know, if you can get more people, if the main obstacle is just that they don't have a way to pay, but they would use certain things, and that's an equity issue. And we've just got to make a switch to EVs. Like all of our public transit should be EV at this point, right? You know, like we need to get more people adopting electric vehicles. We need to lower the cost of those electric vehicles. We need to improve battery technology. We need to have more charging stations, et cetera, right? I mean, the Tesla is like really the only model. Well, you all might know more than me about EVs, but like one I see everywhere is Tesla, and that has like a very clear class distinction to it. Like I'm not gonna go tell some mom who's, you know, got her first job and she's making $25,000 a year that she should get an electric vehicle because it's better for the environment, right? That's crazy. And I mean, we just need to be realistic about how much money some people are making. Like families living in the projects, you know, like in public housing, you're making like maybe $30,000 a year for a family of 6. That's crazy, you know? So
What about automation? What do you think?
like automated vehicles?
Uh-huh.
Well, there's some models, right, that show that actually increases congestion.
Right.
And there was this idea we had once where you could have like AVs just floating around high density areas and places where we know that people are living and they need to get to work, like affordable housing units, like you could just have a fleet of AVs. That's possible. Yeah,
But the economic model may not be so convincing, I guess, because those are, again, will be more expensive, probably, not on per ride basis though. But, you know, as you were saying, maybe Tesla is kind of also at the same time an AV, like high level AV. And maybe, you know, it just like Zipcar might not be here because, you know, there's just economically not enough demand for them to have the this located in affordable housing.
but if you had KCDC in the city subsidizing Zipcar, then it might work.
Yeah.
You know, and if you had more information about, well, who's employed, where are they employed, what time do they work, when do they need to get there? One of the big things about affordable housing is you often see people working in second and third shifts. And so public transit isn't even an option if you're working third shift, frankly, or second shift, right? But yeah, if you had greater public investment in some of these technologies, and if you could see longer term economic impact, so if you keep more people employed,
Yeah.
right? Mobility from work, home to work and work to home is such an issue. And it's a massive impediment to people getting employment and staying employed. Like I will, like in our qualitative interviews, people talk about this all the time, that, you know, they had a first initial screening for an interview, and then the supervisor found out they didn't have a car, and they never got a call back. There's just there's a bias against people without cars. I think we all know that, really. So if you don't have a car, people don't take you seriously, or they think that you must be, there's just basically it's discrimination against persons without cars, particularly in the context of employment.
So you think spatial mismatch is still existing in a substantial way?
Yes, but the problem with spatial mismatch is that it's very hard and long term to redesign land use. Like take down the strip right here. Like, okay, I kind of get this is just my opinion, but it seemed like, okay, I understood that they tried to discourage automobile traffic, but what did they fail to do? Encourage pedestrian traffic. So it's not like there's all these people walking around and finding it such a lovely, pleasant place. In fact, it's really just a gridlock, right? So even when they have great plans, I feel like those aren't even always so great. And then it took how many years to redesign the strip, right? And it's this tiny, tiny little block that's just for like college students and professors. So it's a little privileged group to begin with who got to enjoy this land use redesign, which in my opinion didn't even work all that well. Because if you walk down the strip, you're exposed to horrible toxic pollutants and the sidewalks are broken and horrible, and
Did you walk down it before?
yes, I did walk down, I just didn't, maybe it's been a long time ago, but it didn't seem super different to me, but maybe this is a great improvement, which shows you how low the bar is, but I do think they could have used more pedestrian encouragement, done things to beautify things, get more investment from the businesses or something to, I don't know, that's just my opinion. But again, it was a very extraordinarily long process for a very small section of road. And if you look at where we're kind of thinking more creatively about land use, again, it tends to be in gentrified areas like Central, to some extent in South Knox, right? But if you go off this one little narrow strip of Central and into some of the very low income parts of North Knoxville, suddenly those bike lanes drop off and broken sidewalks are everywhere and there's no more cool brew pubs, right? So I would love if we can merge transportation planning with land use planning more effectively, but it's kind of like you have to pick them.
So KCDC is building a bunch of stuff now,
Yes.
and they've built some things that are really terrible for transportation in the past. So they've got to run these meandering bus routes out in the middle of nowhere because they found some cheap piece of land somewhere
But can we,
30 years ago, and they paid the price many times over in their transit service. So I don't see land use on your,
no.
your list of
So
solutions here.
I intentionally left it off because in the past I've been dinged by transportation engineers. You know,
What?
been dinged by transportation engineers.
The best transportation plan is a land use plan. Everybody knows that.
I would agree, but in the past, I'm grateful for this conversation and the fact that it was brought up because historically for me, coming from a different discipline, what seemed really obvious to me is often viewed as like not something we want to talk about because we're not in the business of redesigning land. We're in the business of designing transportation.
Well, the fact that you're talking about pooled ride shares and data-informed public transit, which is implying to me that you get the circuitous sort of routes that you're taking through neighborhoods, trying to pick people up at their doors, is essentially a symptom of bad land use planning, because essentially you can't run a cost-effective public transit system without simple fixed routes. I don't think. The pooled ride shares that have been successful have mostly been successful by poaching the most lucrative fixed route services in the city, and that's why a lot of big-time transit agencies don't really like them that much. Is they're just shaving the most effective routes ridership, and then leaving the transit agency with the real low performers, and then it's the massive death spiral of transit where their service gets cut, their ridership goes down even further. And so if you look at human transit or some of these other approaches, it's simple direct routes that serve the most people, but not trying to serve everybody at once. And if you want to live in a place that has transit service, you got to live on the corridor. Some of CAT's routes are so ridiculous you can walk faster.
Right. But
Because they go up and down every block trying to meet everything. The process we build it.
But some people don't have the option to choose where they can live, and that's what's really important. And so if we can't immediately redesign land use, what can we provide to create more equitable solutions? And I don't know if the data-informed public transit operator, if that would necessarily lead to more meandering routes and more expensive transit that would be unfeasible economically. Like, we should try it out and test it. But I know we're running out of time.
No, that's fine.
But I am grateful for your comments and your critical thoughts, because that's definitely stuff to think about. And I totally agree that we should be redesigning land use. And many of our problems are the consequences of poor land use. Again, what did I say at the very beginning? Like, the space in the United States is our greatest blessing and our greatest curse. But we have to think sort of also real politically in terms of strategically, how can we tackle issues right now and not make a community that's underserved wait 50 years for when we're finally going to redesign land use. And like redesigning like suburban Knoxville is going to take a lot of political will.
So I did a study on on this smart growth, and neo-traditional developments are the kind of the solution for suburban developments. It seems people are willing to pay a higher price for sidewalks on both sides of the road and so on. I don't know. They haven't seen a lot of interest, but there is a substantial amount of interest, and I think that might be, for in the US context, a very successful strategy. But I don't know how cities are adopting it.
I don't think Knoxville is,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And it's right. And when you have like no geographic boundaries, I mean, you have these
Yeah,
perceptions
have.
of, and you also have redlining and you have racism, but racism undergirds so much of our land use. People choose and intentionally live separated from other persons based on race and income. And that drives a lot of this disparity actually is, if you really go back down to a sociological level, it's racism and fear of others.
Well, thank you so much for